Okay, we are on Daf Lamed Hey Amid Aleph 35a, and in the last Mishnah, we're talking about a case where the Eruv that the person had placed inside a chest, the key was lost, and it's going to be a good Eruv according to the first opinion. In the second opinion, Rabbi Eliezer says it's not going to be a good Eruv if he doesn't know where the key for the chest is. And the Gemara asks the question, well, he can't access the Eruv without the key, so why would it be a good Eruv? The first opinion, and the Gemara is going to have various interpretations. The first said that it was a brick, we're talking about a brick, a brick chest, a brick house, if you would, that the Eruv is in, but it's not actually cemented together. It's a pile of bricks around each other, and just the weight of it is holding it. And then you could take one out, according to Rabbi Meir, and then get to your Eruv. So that's the first interpretation of the explanation of the Mishnah why a lost key is going to be okay, because you can access it another way through removing a brick because it's not cemented in. On Lamed Hey Amid Aleph 35a, we're going to have the second interpretation of Rabbi Rav Yosef. This is about 10 lines in at the top of 35a. Rabbi Rav Yosef Damar Tavayu. They both interpret. You know what's going on over here? Our mission is dealing with a wood structure. However, it's a wood structure that's outside, that's not attached to the ground, and therefore it constitutes a vessel. And as a vessel, in removing a hinge or removing one part in order to access the inside of the vessel is going to be stira b'kelim, deconstructing a vessel. And as long as you're not doing a proper deconstruction that's going to give you a good opening, then you're allowed to do it on Shabbos. As we saw in the Masechah Shabbos, that there's a concept of ein binyan b'kelim, ein stira b'kelim. There's no construction or deconstruction in vessels. Now, even though that if you're properly constructing a vessel, making a proper hole in it in order to make an opening that you could put things in and take it out, that would count as construction of a vessel. But in minor adjustments to a vessel, making reopening holes or breaking something that's not really going to be a good usable part of the vessel, it will not constitute a construction or deconstruction of a vessel. So the construction or deconstruction, binyan or stira, in regards to kelim vessels, is limited to something that's a very very fine and complete kind of act. And therefore, if you have a chest, a wood chest that has your Eruv in there and you lost the key, there are other ways of opening this up which would be permissible. So we're talking about a chest that's made of wood, the maras of a kalihu, and depending on the size, we also saw this idea that a vessel larger than the size that would contain a mikvah, which is 1 amma by 1 amma by 3 ammas. So if an amma is a foot and a half, so we're talking about 18 inches by 18 inches by under 5 feet. So if you had a chest like that, that no longer constitutes a vessel, and perhaps that would constitute a proper structure. So the Ma'asav HaKalihu, one says that no, it's a vessel, and therefore ve'im b'nim b'kelim v'stir b'kelim, and there's no applicable prohibition of deconstruction in such a vessel, and so you can access the Eruv by breaking it open. And one says no, it is a construction, it is a tent at that size, and then it would count as deconstruction. And this is based on a machlokas in regards to Tuma that we're going to see now. And the Gemara is going to try and link this idea to where we see a vessel, whether or not a chest like this, a vessel will count as a tent or count as a vessel in regards to Tuma. Now, we know that there are various forms of Tuma. one of the tumas that we have for a bodily tuma that comes out for a person, zav, zava, etc., there's going to be the tumas hesed, a tuma of pressure or pushing something. So the Tanan we learned, this person punched or pushed a vessel. So this person punched or pushed a vessel, whether it was a chest, a box, a cabinet. Tameim, they will now be tamei. Rabbi Nechemi and Rabbi Shimon matarin. However, Rabbi Nechemi and Rabbi Shimon, they say, no, it would not be tamei. Wouldn't you say this is the basis of that machlokas? Mar savar klihu, umar savar oil. One says, oh, this is a chest. It counts as a vessel, and one says, oh, it counts as a ohel, a tent. And this is going to be the distinction. As a tent, it's not susceptible to tumah by this pressure. It's not a vessel. And the first opinion says that it's tamei by the pressure. It's not going to be touching. So Rashi says he didn't actually touch it because he is either using a glove or, as I said, he used a bat or something to hit it. But it's a vessel. It's going, so therefore it's going to be susceptible to tumah. Abaye. So Abaye challenged that and said, no, that can't be v'tizbara. Is that really the reason that it's not going to be tamei on account of that it's a tent and not a vessel? And if it was a vessel, it's susceptible to tumah. Vatanya, look at the brisa, which is going to explain the distinction differently. Ohel v'niset tamei. If you have a tent, meaning this person set up tent. Someone had a tent that was set up, and the tamei pushed it, and now it moved on account of the push. Tamei, it would be susceptible to tumah, even though it's a tent. Kli ve'inanisid. If you have a vessel and it's really solid and heavy, and somebody that's a zav or that has this tumah pushes it, but it doesn't move, even though it's a vessel, it's not going to be susceptible to tumah. So tahor, it's going to be tahor. Tani seifa, and on that we explained. The brisa continued and ended and said that in this pushing of punching the chest, that if it moved, it would be susceptible to tumah. That if this chest was pushed, it would be tamei. In other words, if it actually moved and shook on account of this punching, it would be susceptible to tumah. So we see that it's not on account of whether it was a vessel or not, but rather whether it actually moved on account of the punching it. Ze'aklal. So this is the rule. Niset machmas kocho. If it moved on account of his push, tamei, then it will be tamei. So the concept of hesed is leaning on something, pushing something. It has to actually move on account of his push, if it was a vessel or a tent. Machmas ra'ada tahor. If it only shook on account of him slamming his foot on the ground or something like that, which made it shake, but there was no actual contact. So it's not going to count as hesed that he actually pushed it, because it just shook by shaking the ground, because that's secondary to his strength. He shook the ground, which shook the tent or this chest, and it's not going to count as tumah. So the distinction is not between whether this counts as a vessel or not, and so we can't compare it to our halacha. So Abaye said the kuli alme heset machmas koche tamei. Everybody says that if as a direct result of his push, something shakes, that's going to be tamei as hesed. Machmas ra'ada tahor. If it's secondary, where he hits the ground and that makes a shake and that rumbles and shakes the chest or the tent, that would not be direct to his action and therefore would not count as a tumas hesed of pushing. However, here we're dealing with he actually leaned on it, he pushed it. However, it didn't actually move on account of him, but because of the pressure, what he did, it shook. And this is what the machlokas is based on. One says that the very fact that it's shook on account of his movement, of his pushing on it, that is significant enough to count as hesed, and it's going to be tamei. And the other says no, that's not enough. So if so we cannot explain the Mishnah necessarily being a distinction between whether it counts as a vessel or not, because actually by Tumah we see it does. They both count as a vessel. So rather, what is our Mishnah? Abai and Rava both say b'mano v'kater b'matna. It has a lock and it has a key attached to it with a zip tie, with a rope, with something that's connected to it. And you require a knife to cut through this rope or string in order to get the key to the lock to unlock it. Now, the problem is that even though you're allowed to cut something like this, as we see in the Gemara in Shabbos, and we'll see in Beitza, the halacha is that when you have a seal, you have something, a wrap around an item, it's made to be broken off and destroyed. So you're not actually cutting something to size, you're not cutting something that was meant to be there. So that's a deconstructive move. You're just destroying this zip tie or rope. You're allowed to cut it on Shabbos. That's going to be permissible. However, the question is, are you allowed to move a knife, which is not made for that, in order to cut it? So if you remember when we learned the laws of muksa in the Gemara and Shabbos, we had three opinions. Rabbi Shimon was the most lenient. He said muksa is specifically to vessels that you intentionally set aside. You would never use it on Shabbos and intentionally set it aside for Shabbos. Various forms of what that would be, whether it's something that would get ruined if you used it, which is called muksa machmas chesron kis, or whether it's something that was used for an isser, it was used for something prohibited, already that Shabbos. Then we had Rabbi Yehuda, who has a broader interpretation of muksa, that anything that you didn't intentionally intend to use on Shabbos is going to be muksa. Rabbi Nechemia had the most strict, which was usually not in the conversation because of how strict it is, but it came up a few times. Rabbi Nechemia's interpretation of muksa is that you can only use a vessel for the very thing that it's made to be used. You can't use it for another use, even if it's a permissible use. You cannot use it for another use. You can only use it for its primary use, and that's this idea over here, where you need, in order to cut this rope, to get or the zip tie, whatever, to get the key to unlock this eruv, you're going to have to use a knife, a muksa item. So you need a knife in order to cut it. So the first opinion says, yeah, sure, go ahead, get your knife and cut it, because everything is permissible to be used on Shabbos. If you're using it in a permissible way, go ahead and use it. And there's no muktzah even on a vessel that typically used for a prohibition, like a scissors. It's permissible to be used for a permissible use. So for sure, in such a case, you need a knife. Go get your kitchen knife and cut it, no problem. However, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Eliezer follows the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia. The afilu talis, afilu tarvet, ein itolen ela letzerach tashmisha. That even a clothing, a regular use item, can only be moved for its primary use. And a knife is not made for cutting rope. A knife is made for a household use, bread, meat, etc. And that's the reason it's going to be prohibited over here. So the machlokes of the Mishnah, we had three interpretations. The Mishnah said you lost the key, or you can't access the key. It's going to be permissible to get the eruv. Rabbi The first interpretation of the Gemara says Rav and Shmuel said we're talking about a brick structure, and the reason it's permissible and the Eruv counts, even though you don't have a key, because the bricks are not cemented to each other, so you can remove a brick according to Rabbi Meir. The second interpretation said that this is a wood cabinet large enough that it could be considered a tent, and the question is it deconstruction of a vessel or is it deconstruction of a tent? Deconstruction of a vessel permissible, deconstruction of a tent prohibited, and if it counts as a vessel, then you can access the Eruv even though you lost the key. The third interpretation says no, the key is there. What it says means the lost the key is that you don't have access to, it won't reach your lock, and you need to cut the rope in order to get it. And on that, there's a machlokas between Rabbi Nehemiah, who says muktzah applies to anything that is not a typical use, and so you can't use a knife to cut that rope. And Rabbi Yossi, or the Chachamim, we're going to follow Rabbi Yossi, that there's no muktzah, and therefore you're allowed to. Here we're going to get into a question of what happens if you don't know what happened to the Eruv. You get information that the Eruv is no longer where it was. It could have rolled out of its place. It could have been eaten. It could have, if it was teruma and it was for a kohen and it became tamei, and everybody agrees a kohen, even we had a machlokas of whether a non-kohen can make an eruv with teruma, which only a kohen can eat. But everybody agrees if it became tamei, where even a kohen can't eat it, it's not going to be a valid eruv because nobody can eat it. Even a kohen can't eat it. And or if a pile of bricks fell, a wall fell, it collapsed, and this eruv is somewhere beneath a pile of bricks. So those are the machlokas we're going to see. Now, we're going to get into the question of suffix. There's a doubt. If you have a doubt of what happened, can we go with a chazaka? Can we go with an established existence until the moment we know that it changed? This is a concept that comes up, chazaka de hashta versus chazaka de meikara. Do we say that what we find is probably what happened? Or do we say, no, what we left was probably there until the moment we find that it changed? So for instance, we have a cheskas chai, the concept that we have a chazaka, and it will come up on the staff, a chazaka that we can assume that if we knew that somebody was alive, that they have the established norm that they are alive until such time that we know that that changed. Or cheskas tahor, somebody was assumed to be tahor. We have the chazaka that he was not tamei, and that will remain until such time that we can be sure that they became tamei. So to the Eruv, can we say, look, the Eruv was there until such time that we know that it's not there, that Eruv is assumed to be there? Or do we say, no, there's a doubt, and therefore it's not a valid Eruv? All that's going to come up here. One important concept that we talked about, but we have to reiterate here. When we talk about it in the Eruv Techumin, that means when somebody lives in a city, they can, we talked about that you square the city and we look at the boundaries, and they can travel 2,000 amma outside of that boundaries. We'll see more later about how that works. But when they put an Eruv out at 2,000 amma, let's say at the north side of the city, they no longer could travel anything outside of the south side of the city. Because if the Eruv is a valid Eruv, that means that they have established their Shabbos at 2,000 amma outside of the north of the city. And so the city itself is the southern end of their own personal boundary. So they can't go outside of the city. So everybody else in the city can leave the city on the south side to 2,000 amma, but they cannot. In this case where we have a doubt, they may not be able to go beyond the 2,000 amma. Also, they may not be able to go anything on the south side, because if the Eruv is a good Eruv, then they have established their space on the north side, which is 2,000 amma, and therefore they can't leave the south side of the city at all. If the Eruv is not valid, they can't go beyond that 2,000 amma on the north, and so they lose on both sides if it's a state of doubt, and we'll see that as well. So with that, we'll start the Mishnah. Nisgalgel. Go ahead. Ask a question.
Yeah.
Cannot hear you.
I'm talking.
You're very low.
Better?
Yeah.
Could you establish two with a Tanai?
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. The question of whether or not you put an Eruv on the north and Eruv on the south and say on Shabbos, I'm going to retroactively decide which one is my space for Shabbos. So as you heard that's, that in a neighboring village, there was a guest speaker, Chacham came to town. You want to go study Torah with him, but you don't know. Your information is crossed, whether it's in the town just south of here or the town just north of here, and you don't know where it is. You want to put an Eruv on both so that you'll be able to go and when you find out the information where they actually are, that's the Eruv. We'll see later of whether you can do that, and that's a concept of Brera, right? And retroactively deciding at a later point what was your proper Eruv. But that's not our conversation today. Chazaka is a fundamental enough question. We don't have to throw in Brera as well, which will come up plenty at a later point. So, Nizgalgel chutz l'tchum. The Eruv was at exactly 2,000 amma. He set up a shop, put his meal there. This is his Shabbos space at the border of his limits of where he's allowed to travel on Shabbos. And then he gets information from someone that was there and said, oh, I saw your Eruv, and it had fallen out of the tree or fallen off of the wall or wherever you put it, and it now is 10 feet away from where it was, farther away from the city. So now you can't access it because you're only allowed to go to 2,000 amma, and that would be your shvisa. But if your bread is actually beyond that, well then maybe at the onset of Shabbos, it wasn't at 2,000 amma, and you are now beyond that space, so you're not allowed to travel at all because you're outside of your own tchum. Nafal alav gal. Or he found that, got information that a wall collapsed over it, so it's non-accessible. Maybe that happened at the onset of Shabbos. Nisraf, or it got burned, no longer there. Teruma v'nitmes, or he had set teruma as an eruv, and it became tummy. So at the onset of Shabbos, perhaps it wasn't edible. So if we know for sure this happened before Shabbos, so then it's not going to be an eruv. However, if this happened once it was already dark, then it's good eruv, because at the onset of Shabbos it was a good eruv. Now, what happens if he doesn't know when it happened? Safek, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, if it's a safek, it's like leading a donkey and a camel at once. A donkey, you lead from the side and back. A camel, you lead from the front. Now, you're going to be a chamar gamel. It's going to be in a way that you can't lead it either way. You lose in the. It's a term. It's a term used. It's a euphemism. It doesn't mean that he's leading any animals here. What it means is you lose on both sides. You can't be behind the camel, and you can't be in front of the donkey. So to over here, you lose. You can't be on the south side of the city because perhaps the Eruv was a good Eruv, and you can't be farther north than 2,000 amma because perhaps it wasn't an Eruv. So either way, you're even worse off than if you hadn't made an Eruv. However, Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon Amrim, Suffolk Eruv Kasha. Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon, they say no. Anytime you have an Eruv and there's a doubt whether it was kosher, you assume it was kosher. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Avtulmus Hayed. So Rabbi Yosef said about Avtulmus made a set of testimony. Mishum Chamisha Zakanim, in the name of 5 of the great Chachamim of that generation. Al Suffolk Eruv Shekasha, like Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Shimon, that anytime you have a doubt of an Eruv Techumin, an Eruv outside of the city, whether that counts as your boundary, as your Kodesh Visa, you're making your space for Shabbos, and you're allowed to travel. Everybody's going to say that you can be lenient. So the Gemara is going to analyze all this. It rolled out of your tchum, outside of the 2,000 amma. Amar Rava, so Rava said, It can't be that it just rolled a little bit within the 4 amos, because the Eruv itself gives you the 4 amos, and he's allowed to go there and bring it back. Since whenever you put your Eruv, you have a space of 4 amos, so you can actually go to that 4 amos and get it back. It must be that it went beyond the 4 amos, and therefore that's no longer the space you originally would have designed, and therefore you are now beyond 2004 amma. So essentially what we have over here is the halacha that a person can not only travel on Shabbos 2,000 amma in either direction, giving him a 4,000 square amma travel boundary. He actually has a 2008 travel boundary. There was a machlokes 2004, 2008. We're going to say 2008 amma. 4,008 amma, because each side he has 2,000 amma plus the 4 ammas that he has just in his space on either side. So a person gets a 4,008 amma halachic boundary. So therefore, if this Eruv rolled off its spot from the 2,000 amma point, but within the 4 amma, he's allowed to retrieve it. Nafal of Gal. The Mishnah said in other cases where a pile of bricks fell on it, or it burnt. So so at first the Gemara thought that that if it is retrievable underneath this pile of bricks. The problem is that the bricks are muktzah, and therefore you're not allowed to move it on account of it being muktzah. So we have a problem that we saw earlier in the first Mishnah that we were talking about this, that followed the opinion of Rebbe that said, you know what, it's in the tree, but there's no problem with taking it off the tree, even though you're not allowed to take something off a tree on Shabbos. But over here, the designation of your space for Shabbos happens at sunset. It happens at the beginning of Bein Hashmoshes, at the beginning of Shabbos. Well, Bein Hashmoshes, at twilight, rabbinic prohibitions don't apply. And so you're allowed to take the bread off the tree. That was Rebbe's opinion. Well, then the same should be over here. If really you can access the bread, and the only issue is that you're moving the muksa bricks. Muksa is at the Rabbanan, and therefore you should be allowed to move the bricks that are on top of this Eruv at the onset of Shabbos. By definition, it's still accessible to you. So maybe we're going to have to say this Mishnah too is not like the previous, the first Mishnah, which is the opinion of Rebbe. The Ikar Rebbe, because Rebbe says anything that's a shvus, a rabbinic Shabbos prohibition, does not apply when it's Bein Hashmoshes, when it's twilight. So Gemara says, now, Philotema Rebbe. And we can even say this according to Rebbe. And over here, the issue is not that you need to pick up bricks to get to your bread, and that's a muktzah, but rather you have to use a tool. Rather, the reason is because you need a shovel and a pick in order to get it. Now, what's the problem if you need a shovel and a pick? We just talked about before that you're allowed to take for a permissible use. You're even allowed to take a muktzah item, such as a shovel, which may be designated for digging, but you're allowed to do it because it's a permissible use. So the Rishonim say that here the issue is that you're actually flattening and preparing the ground for reconstruction of this fence, of this brick wall that collapsed, and that's boneh. That's a form of construction, and that's the issue. When you're using a shovel and you're using a pick to get this, you're actually fixing and finishing the ground, preparing it for the reconstruction, and that's a Torah prohibition. At the onset of Shabbos, there's no distinction between Bein Hashmoshes twilight or midday Shabbos day. It's equally prohibited, and so you can't access your Eruv. And why did we mention then burnt up and a pile of bricks falling on it? It would seem it's exactly the same. So who cares in the Mishnah? Why would we have to give two examples of a bricks falling in it or burning up? So the Gemara says, "Tzricha, I need them both." The itan and his galgil. If it said it rolled out and it's not accessible, because it's not by your space. I don't know if all of Gal, but a pile of bricks falls on it. It actually is still in its original space where you put it. It's inaccessible. Perhaps it's a good error. If it just said that the pile of bricks fell on it, because it's covered. Avalon is galga, but it rolled out. Perhaps it could roll back in. A wind can shift and blow it back in, and it'll be okay. And then it'll bring it back within the 4 amos, and then you can retrieve it. So perhaps it's a good eruv. Tzrichas, I would say that we need them both. Now, v'in nisraf, truma v'nitmes, if it got burnt up, or it was truma and it became tummy. Lamali nisraf. Lamali tana nisraf. What does it have to say if it burnt up? So now we go Lamed Hamid base. To teach you how the strength of the opinion of Rabbi Yossi that says even though that right now leisa ba'olam, it is no longer existent, it's totally burnt up, we're still going to be lenient and say, you know what, at the onset of Shabbos it may have still been there. Right now it's gone, but at the onset of Shabbos it could have been there, and therefore it's going to be a valid eruv. Tana truma v'nitmes l'yachakachad Rabbi Meir, and it tells you that it was truma and it became tummy. That also this machlok is to tell you the strength of Rabbi Meir. That says that even though it's still right there, it's where it originally was. It's just a question of whether or not it became tummy, and therefore you can no longer eat it. It's not allowed to be eaten, but it is still right where it was. And therefore, at Bein Hashmashas, at the onset of Shabbos, I should say, you know what? Beforehand it was tahar. At the time that I put it down there, it was tahar, and so I have a chazaka. I have an established norm that this was a tahar, a pure piece of teruma, and now I know it became tummy, but I don't know when it became tummy. So perhaps I should say that the chazaka, the status quo of this, the status of this food was that it was tahar, and it remained tahar at the onset of Shabbos, and it should be a good eruv. So we're not going to say chazaka to be lenient. We're not going to use the chazaka to be lenient and say you can rely on it that it was as it was beforehand and it was a good eruv. And that's the stringency of Rabbi Meir. So now the Gemara is going to challenge that. It says, is that really true that Rabbi Meir, who's the Stam Mishnah, because the Mishnah did not attribute any for the, in general we have a Mishnah unattributed is Rabbi Meir, and we're going to see the Mishnah in Mikvos that's going to be strict in regards to a doubt. And over here, we say that Rabbi Meir is, lenient in a doubt in a matter d'Rabbanan. And over here, we have a Mishnah that Rabbi Meir is strict in regards to the Eruv and says, look, you have to be strict. Maybe it was already tummy, even though it had a chazaka to start with. It was in the status of tahor, and that status quo could and should remain until we know that it changed. Yet Rabbi Meir is being strict and saying, no, we're going to assume it changed earlier, and as an invalid eruv, instead of saying that instead of saying that it was a chazaka by a darabanan should be lenient. Vatanan. We learned in the second parak of Mikvos. Tameh sheyarad litvo. Somebody who's for sure tahor. Tameh. He came into contact with something that made him tameh. And he goes into the mikveh. Safek tavel, safek le tavel. But he doesn't know if he got completely in or not. And he's in doubt. Maybe there was some sort of barrier. Maybe his finger was still sticking out. And he wasn't in the mikveh entirely. So he doesn't know whether he actually went to the mikveh or not, whether it counts that he went to the mikveh or not. Or he knows that he went to the mikveh, but safek tavel bar b'imsah, safek lo tavel bar b'imsah. But he doesn't know whether the mikveh was the requisite amount. It had been hot, and the water had been evaporating, and right now he sees it's below the line, and he doesn't know when he went into the mikveh, was it below the line or not? Or similarly, shnei mikvahs, there are two mikvahs side by side. One of them was measured and has the requisite amount, 40 seah, and one does not. And he doesn't know which one he went into. All these cases, the doubt whether he became tar, he was tameh. We don't know whether he completely went to the mikveh. So tar is going to be tar. He's going to be remain tamei until we know that he went to the mikvah. Now, in all these cases, he actually went to a mikvah. It's just a doubt of whether it was so he did the action. It's just whether he did the correct action or a valid action. So we actually have a chazaka against it, which is the big discussion about, do I say the mikveh has a chazaka that is kosher, or do I say that the person has a chazaka that is tamei? The Gemara is not getting into that aspect of it right now. Tues gets into it, and this is the Gemara at the beginning of Nida and elsewhere. However, the Gemara brings the next Mishnah as well, which says like this: the med varmamurim. When is this true that we're strict? By the strict tumah, meaning a Torah level tumah. Hava tumah kala, but by a rabbinic tumah, which the Chachamim enacted certain tumas, and we're going to list a few of them. There, we're going to be lenient. Kagon, she'achal echlon tamei. Somebody ate tamei food, which normally would not make a person tamei, but nevertheless, since he consumed it, the Chachamim made it a tumah. Or drank liquids that are tamei, or he went swimming in a non-mikvah. The mikvah has to be rainwater that was never gathered. The Chachamim enacted that anybody goes into gathered water, a non-proper mikvah that is the size of a mikvah, and they go in with head and torso into such a mikvah, they become, since it's an invalid mikvah, they become tamei and have to now go to the mikvah. Or gathered water was poured on top of him, also rabbinic tumah, and has to go to the mikvah. And if that person who has such a rabbinic tumah went down to such a mikvah and had all of these doubts, or any of these doubts that we mentioned before, Yored Litva, Safek Tavel, Safek Lo Tavel, he went down with the intent to go to the mikvah, but then is not sure whether he completely immersed or not. Philo Tavel, and even if he completely immersed, the question he has a different question. Maybe Safek Tavel, Safek Lo Tavel, maybe there wasn't the requisite amount in this mikvah. Or the case was that there were two mikvahs set beside, one has the requisite 40 sa and one does not. And he went into one and he's not sure which one he went into. Sveikoto, the suffix is going to be tar, he can be lenient. Now, that the reason is because it's a rabbinic tumah, and therefore he can be lenient, even though we're established that he was tamei beforehand in this rabbinic tumah. But we can be lenient and say you can undo that with a suffix, with a doubt of whether he went to the mikvah proper or not. It's going to be valid. There, Rabbi Yossi metami. Rabbi Yossi says no, it's not going to be. Since you have a chazaka beforehand, it's not going to it's not going to change it with a doubt of whether you went to the mikvah or not. In any case, but the first opinion, which is an unattributed Mishnah, and we know that an unattributed Mishnah, Stam Mishnah, Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir over there is saying that for a rabbinic tumah, a rabbinic level doubt of whether or not something changed with this person, we're going to be lenient and say that he became tar, that the mikvah was valid, and he became, and it changed him from tamei to tar. So for sure over here in regards to an eruv, we have the established norm that it was there and it was not tamei, and it's a rabbinic mitzvah of putting the eruv out there. So perhaps it should be lenient. So the Gemara says no. Kasavar Rabbi Meir Tchumen Daraisa. You're right that if this was rabbinic, then we would be lenient. However, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that an eruv of techumen, of the boundaries of the distance, the maximum distance you're allowed to go, is the oraisa, is a Torah concept. And since it's a Torah concept, now we have a doubt in a Torah matter of whether or not you established your shvisa, you established your space for Shabbos 2,000 amma away or not. Did you have a proper meal or not? Therefore, we have to be strict on account of the oraisa question of whether or not you've made an eruv valid outside of your city. Is that really true? The Rameir is of the opinion that techumen, this mitzvah of putting an eruv, or the concept of having an eruv, of having a limit to your to your city of 2,000 amma, is that the Torah concept, and therefore the eruv being a Torah obligation? What time we learned? The halacha is ein yochel havliyai. Somebody, the city boundary committee, Eruv boundary committee, is getting together and they're trying to measure on one side of the city up till where you're going to measure your 2,000 amma, but they can't because there are hillsides. So what do you do? In the name of Rabbi Meir, it was said, Shamati, I heard, I've learned that what you do is Shemekadrim Bahar. So you make an imaginary bored hole through the hillside. And basically you measure the way the crow flies, even though that you can't walk that way. So we don't measure 2,000 amma up the hillside, down the hillside. It's a straight line and imaginary hole through the hillside. Now, but if you say that this is a Torah obligation or a Torah prohibition of going beyond 2,000 amma, would we measure that way? We know it's not true in regards to other Torah concepts, such as in measuring, we find a murdered body outside of a city and measuring which is the closest city. That's Egla Arufa. Allah is that Ein Makadrim. You can't make an imaginary bored hole. You have to measure as is. Not in the measure of an ir miklat, of a city of refuge for manslaughter people, and not in regards to finding a murdered body, which we measure to the closest city, because those are Torah obligations. So you can't make an imaginary bored hole. You have to actually go with the topography. So to over here, if this was a Torah obligation of Eruv, of Techumen, of the limit of your city boundaries, so then how could Rabbi Meir say that you make this imaginary boring through the hillside and that's going to define your boundary limits the way the crow flies? We see elsewhere the statement that it doesn't, in Torah matters you don't do that. So Amar says you're right. Look, Rabbi, that when he said Shamati, I heard that you can bore through, he was teaching the teaching from his teachers. He was saying over from the Chachamim from the previous generation, but he himself holds that it is a Torah obligation, Torah prohibition, and therefore he's strict in a matter of doubt. Dekanami, and indeed we can deduce that from the text. Because we said in this brisa that he said, Rabbi Tzvi said in the name of Rabbi Meir, Shamati, I heard Shemekadrim Baharim. In other words, that's a teaching from that he was makabel from his teachers, but not his opinion. Shmami. V'rami deraisa Rabbi Meir. But nevertheless, we have a contradiction in the oraisa matters according to Rabbi Meir. The Tanan we learned. Noga be'echad balayla ve'enideim chayim beis. Somebody was camping out with some friends, and in the middle of the night, he remembers touching someone laying next to him. But he assumes he's alive, right? When he wakes up in the morning, he sees that the guy next to him that he probably that he touched in the middle of the night is dead now. Now, was he dead at the time he touched him? Did he become tamei from touching a deceased person? So Rabbi Meir says he remains tahor. He remains unchanged. And this is a Torah tumah, a Torah level tumah of touching a deceased person. And nevertheless, since at the time, in the middle of the night, when they went to sleep, they were both alive. So he has a chazaka, he has an established status quo of being alive, and therefore, what moment do you have to assume he died? Just when you found him? Or a moment before that? The Chachamim say, no, hey, you're tamei. Shekol tamei is kashas mitziyasen. And Rabbi Meir's explanation is because every tumah is at the moment you find it to be tamei. So to over here, why are you assuming that the teruma, the Eruv became tamei prior to Shabbos, and therefore it wasn't a valid Eruv because you're not allowed to eat it. So it was not a valid Eruv at the onset of Shabbos. Rabbi Meir says that even when we find somebody dead, which is the strictest of tumas, and you touched this person in the middle of the night, you just didn't realize that he was dead at that time. Rabbi Meir says, well, we don't know that he was dead at that time, and you'd be tar. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Mishnaseinu Shahaya L'Sheretz Bein Hashmoshes. Yirmiyah says, you know what? It must be that the entire time of the onset of Shabbos, from the beginning to the end of the onset of Shabbos, Bein Hashmoshes, the entire twilight, there was a sheretz on this bread and made it tummy. So Gemara says, what? That can't be. So then who would say that it's not tummy? Who would say it's a good Eruv? So the Gemara is going to end, and we're going to end with this and continue the conversation tomorrow. Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef both say, you know what we're talking about? There are two contradictory testimonies. We're talking about two contradictory witnesses. One set of witnesses says the Eruv was valid and good at the time of the onset of Shabbos, and one said it's not. And now we run into whether Chazaka can assist that contradiction of witnesses.